All right. Hey, I'm back for episode 7 now. This is I guess this is technically my third video for exam 2. However, there was a fourth attempt in between, but it was, like I mentioned in the last one, pretty poor, and I didn't even get through it. I was, yeah, crunched for time. But anyway, so yeah, the exam is, let's see, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so 5 days out. I'm feeling pretty decent. Like I said, there's a few on here that I'm still not really super confident with, but there's also a few on here that I'm feeling pretty decent with. So just a matter of kind of keep working through, and then maybe taking advantage of the group study sessions we got planned this week and fleshing out some better answers with a couple others. So yeah. Yep, just gonna run through. I've added a little more to the PowerPoint just to help visualize and understand some of these answers a bit more. Outside of that, I really don't have much else to report on this front. Yeah, so I think I'll probably just get started. In terms of the ability of federal, why is this thing rocking around? I don't know, it's kind of annoying. Anyway, and in terms of the ability of federal land agencies to authorize and restrict mining activities on federal public lands, how does the General Mining Law of 1872 differ from the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920? So, General Mining Law of 1872, prospectors or any citizen of the United States or person who's shown intent to become taking the steps of intent to become a citizen of the United States, has the right of exploration, the prospect of federal public lands that haven't been withdrawn. So they have the right to mine federal public lands. Yeah. And then the General Mining Law of 1872 only applies to locatable minerals, and this is going to be your gold, silver, copper, lithium, stuff like that. No permit, or license required. The miner, once they have a claim established under the General Mining Law of 1872, they're only required to pay a fee of $125 per year to hold that claim. So they kind of have a security of tenure. It's a pretty minimal threshold to retain your claim. And so like I said, it only applies to the domain lands, so lands that have been held by the federal government since they became a part of the United States, not lands that have been reacquired. Like the situation with a lot of the national forests out east, where that had previously been private or state, and then the Forest Service or the U.S. federal government reacquired them. And then I guess I did, I got it in here prior to 1995 and the 1-year moratorium. Land, claims could be patented after 5 years, but that's at $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre. However, that has since been, like I mentioned, there's been a 1-year moratorium on that every year, so it no longer, it's really not in effect anymore. But it is a difference, it is a difference between the Mineral Leasing Act. So here's just a few things then, I guess, about the Mineral Leasing Act. It only applies to leasable minerals, and this is oil, gas, oil shale, phosphates, sodium, and certain other minerals. There's not that right to mine like there is in the General Mining Law that states that any citizen or person with intent to become a citizen of the United States has the right to explore and prospect federal public lands. Not the case with the Leasing Act. It's a competitive leasing market. So the government will make these leases available. They'll do an online auction for the right to mine that land. There are non-competitive leases where there maybe isn't. I can't remember the exact language they use to define these, but it's like either the status of like the potential for what the oil quantity on that land would be, or they're even just deemed like low quality leases. So there's non-competitive leases that you can go out and get, but it's still not, you don't have that right to mine. The government has quite a bit more discretion on what can be leased at. They have discretion over where oil and gas drilling can take place on federal public lands because they have to make it available to lease, and then they have discretion about giving out leases as well. And those leases are fixed term. They don't have that indefinite. Like the General Mining Law, which just requires a fee every year to retain it. These leases are fixed term. and so they're only going to be held. I think it's 10 years. I'm pretty sure. And yeah, so the those competitive leases are also designed to get more of a fair market value for that that lease, that land, than the general mining law, which they're only paying $125 per year to retain the mineral rights to that land in the case of the non-patented claims. And the government, I mean, in both cases now, the government still retains ownership of the land, but of the federal lands that are being leased, or in non-patented claims at least. Like I said before, those agencies have the discretion to make lands open or closed for development with the Leasing Act, and yeah, the money, the money that's collected with those leases, through royalties, and I think like rent is also. Yeah, so the government collects rent, royalties, and payments of a reclamation bond, but the royalties that's shared with the state, and then they also like I said, the reclamation bond. There's some of that royalty will go towards reclamation, so that rent, there's money going back into the system with the leasing act, and typically I don't know, I got the 12.5% royalty rate on here. I don't know if that's average or if that's just a fixed rate. I can't imagine that they just have a fixed rate for royalties, though. So I'm guessing that's just kind of what it averages around. Describe one common explanation as to why the general mining law of 1872 has been so resistant to change over the years. Are you in favor of modernizing this law? If so, explain how you would do so exactly, making explicit reference to the parts of the 1872 law you want to change. Okay. So I do got a slide that slightly, kind of connects with this, and I don't have this slideshow in a very good order, but so what we've kind of talked about in class quite a bit, and in the book, it's mentioned a fair amount as well. But one reason that at least the general mining law has been so resistant to change has definitely been through like the work of concentrated interests, like such as mining companies or the National Mining Association, who favor the generous nature of the GML, like how it kind of subsidizes or incentivizes mining on federal public lands. So these concentrated interests, like I mentioned previously, mining companies, National Mining Association, they'll provide electoral support to Congress, and this can be either just by using their voice or campaign donations, to curry favor with Congress members to kind of sway the decision that maybe something if a proposed reform bill is coming through the Congress, those concentrated interests of those mining companies will definitely use what leverage they can to lobbying, like I said, mentioned lobbying, electoral support, or campaign donations and such, to kind of sway Congress, members of Congress, to vote one way or the other when considering a mining reform law. And I do have on this slide, I got the iron triangle here. I think that's kind of the term that's used to refer to it. And I guess in this case, we're really only looking at like this relationship here with the interest group in Congress. These interest groups being people who would favor the GML, which might be mining companies. So they'll provide Congress with electoral support. They'll endorse somebody or provide campaign donations and such, and then Congress returns the favor with maybe some friendly legislation oversight, and then and they also might funding and political support to those bureaucracies that, like I said, that doesn't exactly pertain to this question, but definitely this relationship here is kind of a big part of this one, that special interest. So I guess I would say the general mining law it's been put into place. It was put in place in 1872. So I definitely think something that's over 100 years old, 150, closing in on 150 years old. It's definitely probably got there's some room for improvement. I don't think it's perfect. So I'm in favor of some sort of reform. Like I think. Like a few here I got is just switching to a lease-based system like the Mineral Leasing Act. So if determining if mineral make kind of, I guess it would be kind of just bringing back that right to mine that is of exploration, right of exploration on federal public lands, and yeah, like going to that leasing system I was discussed with the Mineral Leasing Act. So it gives a little more discretion on where and when an area can be mined, or at least just explored for mining. And yeah, it also maybe gets a little more fair market value, and also it yeah, it's not it'll be on it's on a fixed term, so someone can't just indefinitely or hold a claim for a very long time with doing very little mineral production. Implementing some sort of royalty system, I think, would be a big part of a possible reform. Uh, you know, uh, Trying to get some money back for those minerals that are publicly owned minerals off publicly owned lands. Getting some money back for that, and then being able to use it towards like reclamation projects, or just giving it back to the maybe the local communities who might be local communities to the the mining operation, and who could potentially be affected by some of the negative side effects of that mining operation as well. Reclamation bond, I think that could definitely that there should be a place for that in the in our reform statute. There are, I mean, like in FLIPMA, for example, and under the plan of operations, they do when a plan of operations is submitted for a mine, they are required to post a reclamation bond. So it is required under other statutes and other rules and regulations, but it's not required by the GML, and that is one of the criticisms of the GML, is that it doesn't. There's not a whole lot of environmental enforcement on at all in it. So I think a reclamation bond would be a pretty prudent thing to have in there. At some point, in that just to ensure that land that's going to be utilized is going to be like reclaimed or restored, or at least somewhat. There's some sort of guarantee there. Big one here, I guess, would be like gathering data on the mineral production of these mines on federal public land, because currently the BLM, at least, they do not currently collect mineral production data for these locatable minerals. They do for minerals, the mineral leases, they'll collect production data, but they don't for the mineral that the locatable minerals. So yeah, the proposal would just be to have for producers to report production volumes and values that they're getting, and this would be good for estimating maybe increases or decreases in royalties. So I think if you were going to implement royalties, you would probably end the reclamation bonds. You'd probably have to have this in order that you could fairly charge charge a royalty in a more fair manner. Maybe increase or decrease the royalty depending on those production numbers. And then also determining too if that reclamation bond is adequate as well, based on production numbers. In terms of royalties, revenue returned to the federal government, how does the Mineral Leasing Act differ from the General Mining Law of 1872? So the Mineral Leasing Act, like I've mentioned before, requires royalties to be paid by the leaseholder to the federal government, and these are based off the market value of the mineral or price received for sale. The General Mining Law there's no royalty requirements on their profits, no money paid to the government for taking and selling minerals from the public lands. Oh, here we go. I got another slide for this next question. What is an inholding found on public land, and what do they have to do with the old patent provision that used to be a part of the 1872 mining law? I guess this time I'm going to lead off with the 1872 mining law patent provision, and then I'll lead into inholding. So, association with the GML, and I'll be saying GML as a substitute for general mining law just to save a little bit of speaking. But anyway, prior to the annual moratorium that began in 1995, claims could be patented. Jeez, I have trouble with that word. The claims could be patented by the holder of the claim after 5 years. That once they met the requirements after those 5 years to hold the claim, they could apply for a patent. They weren't necessarily guaranteed to get that land as a patent, but they could apply for it. And essentially, if their patent was approved, they would be able to purchase that land for $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre, depending on what type of claim it was, placer versus load. And so essentially, they were paying the 1872 land prices of $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre. And yeah, and then the claimant, if patent's approved, they buy the land, they become the outright private owner of the land, and they're free to do as they please. Their activities on that claim or on the patented land no longer have to be mining related, because that is one of the stipulations with the unpatented claimed, is that operations occurring on that land have to be mining related. So here I kind of have, and so then that leads right into what is a private inholding. Well, these private inholdings are these little chunks of land that are dispersed throughout wider holdings of federal public land. And I don't think you can probably read it. It's a little fuzzy on the screen there, but state or privately owned land, including subsurface rights of such owners underlying public lands or a valid or other valid occupancy that is within or effectively surrounded by one or more areas. And then I that's the CFR definition of it. It's a little I kind of follow it, but it's more simply, it's a piece of private or state land held within a larger area of federal public lands. And here I got an example. I just went on to Onyx yesterday when I made the slide and zoomed in on this is the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. But so yeah, here all this here, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it on the video, but all this here is U.S. Forest Service land, and then within it you have these private inholdings here. And this one is an actual, this one's got mining. I can't even read it off the projector. I know it's a mining company, so this was obviously, I think all of these were previous mining claims that had been patented prior to 1995 and now are just private inholdings within the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. And you can tell they're irregular, they're not a court, exact, they're the former claim boundaries, so they're not quarter sections or they're not anything specific with a homesteading act or anything like that. So you can definitely see how those would pose a management challenge, kind of going back to the first exam, when you have these these dispersed throughout a national forest, trying to plan around these could definitely pose challenges, not to mention say of a wildfire challenges, dealing with these landowners could definitely, like I said, pose some challenges for sure. Could a state government impose some type of reasonable regulation on a developer of a proposed mine under the 1872 General Mining Law? Would such a regulation be automatically preempted under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution? Please explain with an example. So the example I went with this one is the People versus Reinhardt California case, relatively pretty recent. 2009, California places a moratorium on dredging on gold dredging in waterways, so statewide. And then in 2012, this guy Reinhardt, he's charged for having and operating a dredge on federal land. So I think it was Forest Service land. He was gold mining with the dredge, and he's charged for having and doing that. And then so Reinhardt objected the charge, challenging that the GML preempted the California state moratorium on gold dredging, or on dredging, yeah. But the California Supreme Court, it goes all the way to the California Supreme Court. The California Supreme Court determines that the act did not regulate mining methods, but the allocation, I should say that the GML does not regulate mining methods, but the allocation of claims. Unlike the moratorium, which regulates the use of specific equipment, California regulation, so the California regulation only pertains to the use of dredging for mining in rivers and streams. It doesn't prohibit other types of mining and locations. The GML would, they kind of say, the GML would preempt the state regulation if the state regulation outright banned mining statewide. But yeah, the California Supreme Court also cites the GML, which still has a clause in there that still defers to state and local law, and we have the clause with state, territorial, and local regulations, so long as they comply. I kind of said it out of order there, but so the GML still calls for people acting under it to comply with state and local regulations. The California Supreme Court also cited the Woodruff Woodruff case in California, which had banned hydraulic mining I can't remember when that was. It was quite a bit earlier though, earlier in the state's history. And that case had cited a similar cause against GML preemption over state environmental regulation. So essentially the GML doesn't automatically preempt a reasonable regulation placed on a mining claim. It would preempt the regulation if the regulation had completely prohibited mining and making it economically unfeasible. So yeah, if the regulation completely made mining economically unfeasible or just completely outright banned it, then it would be preempted by the GML and the Supremacy Clause, as we saw, in cases like Kleppe versus New Mexico. At least, that the GML would preempt state law or state regulation, I guess in this case, on federal public land. However, there was this mention of the Granite Rock precedent case, which it established as commercial and practicability test, in which state regulation makes mining economically unfeasible, therefore it equals an effective ban on mining, and then yes, the GML would preempt the state regulation. However, the GML was not the moratorium was not on dredging, was not severe enough to the point that all mining on federal lands would be impractical. Because then if it made all land, mining on federal lands impractical, then it would be considered a land use plan, and then the state regulations would be preempted by if those regulations were considered a land use plan, then they'd be considered land planning, and then if it was considered land planning, then it would be preempted by FLIPMA or NIFMA in this case on those federal lands. And I think I kind of just got lost in the sauce a little bit on that one, answering that. But yes, the states can still make reasonable regulations against mining, as long as it doesn't completely outright ban mining or make mining economically unfeasible. Because in this case, it was only banning one type of mining in a certain situation. Go ahead, me some water. Okay, let's see. What do we got? Next one up. And I was also, I guess with the last one, like the Granite Rock precedent thing, like that's a bit unclear to me. But I do understand, so if it was considered a land use plan, then it would be preempted by NIFMA or FLIPMA. So that I guess I understand that, but still it was kind of fuzzy, that portion. And I think that's a bit outside the scope of the question, though, going into the Granite Rock precedent stuff. So I'm not too concerned about it, but we'll see. I'll ask about it as well. Very basically, what are the two ways that federal public lands could be withdrawn from mineral entry under the 1872 General Mining Law? So one way is through the legislative. Congress can withdraw lands through statute. Just a few examples here. The Wilderness Act of 1964, there were lands specifically designated when that act had been passed by Congress that would be withdrawn from mining, essentially, or closed to mineral entry at least. Same with the Mining and the Parks Act of 76, which closed parks and monuments that had been previously opened to mineral entry. And then I got another one here is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Public land within designated wild river boundaries is close to mineral entry. Now there was, in class we talked about and in the book how there are pre-existing claims and patented private land that still falls within the boundary of these wilderness areas or national parks can still be operated. They can't. I don't think they can't expand operations, but they can still operate on their as they were before the wilderness area or the park came into being. And then they can also federal lands can be withdrawn through the executive, and this could be an executive order by the president acting withdrawing lands from entry by using the Antiquities Act of 1906, or they could also use it can also be done by the Secretary of Interior through FLIPMA, Section 204 of FLIPMA, but then that also comes with some requirements or restrictions, I guess, on that withdrawal. It can only they only are the withdrawals under the 204 of FLIPMA are here's just a couple like broad things, but like they can only be withdrawn for 20 years, and then that withdrawal has to be renewed. Or there's also, you got your emergency withdrawal, which is just got a 3-year limit on it. And then there were some more like stipulations based on like area, like size of the area being withdrawn, because there was like, yeah, if it was like greater than 5,000 acres, then it was the audit, like the 20 years, and then must be renewed. And then there was like less than 5,000 acres, which is like as long as the secretary deems it like necessary for the resources. But I think that was also limited. I'm not too sure, but essentially, yes, it can also be done by the Secretary of Interior can withdraw through FLIPMA, Section 204 of FLIPMA as well. That is another executive option to withdraw lands from mining. So, legislative and executive. With sufficient detail, describe two widespread and often repeated criticisms of the General Mining Law of 1872. So, I guess one being, or I guess my first one I went with here, is the lack of royalties. So, like I said, in the Leasing Act of 1920, royalties are charged on profits from minerals mined, and the revenue is shared with the state and put towards land reclamation funds. The GML doesn't require any royalties to be paid on minerals sold, and by not charging royalties on profits made from harvest of public minerals, the government is kind of it's subsidizing in a way the mining companies. And like there's the argument like, well, it's technically the public that owns these minerals; they should be getting a cut. Now, granted, like they're not the ones out there going doing the hard work, paying the high upfront cost, exploring, looking for these minerals, prospecting. So there's a lot that goes into it, and I don't think it's like black and white there on that. But there's that argument that they are publicly owned minerals that are being mined and sold. And then another big criticism would be the lack of like direct environmental protections within the GML itself. They're like I mentioned earlier. The agencies have regulations for mining on their lands, but those are limited in what in their scope and how they can be applied. And then same with like there's like state regulations, obviously kind of going back to the Reinhardt case, but even those are pretty limited in because as you could in that case. They were pretty, it went to the California Supreme Court, and there was talk about it going to the Supreme Court after that decision. I think it didn't end up getting the writ of cert. But yeah, so the GML has no real environmental regulations, especially even like pertaining to reclamation. I think is kind of one of the bigger arguments that there's lack of reclamation guarantees. Yeah, and like just a couple facts from the BLM. There's I guess BLM estimated around 500,000 abandoned hard rock mining sites in the U.S. And like a lot of these sites, the companies that had, the mining companies that had established them are, long gone. They, closed up shop and went out of business, and, it's probably been over 100 years. So there's no one to be held, accountable on those anymore. And there's, and mentioned in the, watching, there was a hearing about the potential for reform, and one of the critiques was the lack what was kind of mentioned about bringing in with the reform bill would be some sort of a Good Samaritan protection, because as of now, if say like an outside organization wants to go in and it starts doing reclamation efforts on these abandoned mine sites, they could also be held accountable for anything in the future that would go wrong. And they'd be open to litigation, so it definitely makes these organizations or anyone kind of weary of going up and trying to clean these mines. So maybe some sort of protection like that could be implemented in a reform bill as well. Not to mention if they implement a royalty in a reform bill, then they would definitely be able to use a portion of that to reclaim these abandoned mine sites throughout the U.S. With sufficient detail, describe two arguments that are made in favor of retaining the General Mining Law of 1872. Please be specific as possible and make a linkage to the legal framework of hard rock mining on public lands. So I got there's a slide, or I guess, I don't know if it really directly pertains. It pertains to kind of the last few questions. But I'll go through my answer to this first, and then I'll kind of tie this in with the general mining law in general, like the critiques for against it and the critiques for it. But yeah, I guess my first one was like an argument made in favor of it would be the right to enter the public domain, that exploration right, free exploration for citizens and people who intend to be citizens. So that right of prospecting the federal public lands that are not withdrawn or required. These industry officials kind of argue that restricting this free access and self-initiation would curtail exploration efforts among small and large mining firms. And even going further, if a lease system were to be implemented, that could definitely prevent and dissuade mining exploration altogether. And they also make the argument of like hard rock mining isn't expensive. Exploration is expensive. It requires a lot of effort, continuous effort, and covering lots of land. I think it's kind of a numbers game. Trying to get out there and cover as much ground as possible. Cast a wide net. And it's expensive, so it's a high upfront cost, and it might be a while before you get any sort of return. So it's at least having that right to do that without having to go out and try to get a lease to go out and explore that land and stuff like that. I could definitely see how that would I can see the argument for it in that case for sure. And then another one, more recent kind of cry for it would be the maintaining a critical mineral supply chain, or keeping a stable supply chain for critical minerals. Mineral material, and these are the critical minerals are like minerals that are determined to be essential to economic and national security. And the supply chain, that their supply chain might be vulnerable to disruption. Maybe we have to we import a lot of them, and maybe they serve an essential function of manufacturing of a product. So the idea is that maybe the GML, the subsidies that the GML offers through this, free exploration, no royalties, minimal, security of tenure, minimal things to hold a claim, might allow for further improving our own domestic supply of critical minerals. And then also here, I guess I got a third argument too that also kind of ties in, but like the incentive, the incentives and the subsidies provided by the GML kind of they keep the U.S. competitive too in mineral production markets. So, there's the argument that like nations with less if we were to implement a royalty and leasing system, those countries that don't have those systems would be able to outcompete the U.S. And then it raised the cost of production for our minerals here in the U.S., which would raise the cost to consumers, and maybe it would even go further and cause those those mining companies based in the U.S. to look to other countries to relocate if where they might be able to make have a higher margin of profit. So I was just reading, or I was just kind of scrolling through some news stuff yesterday, and I saw this come up where the BLM in Nevada had announced that they announced their record decision for approving the preferred alternative of the final EIS for the Rhyolite Ridge lithium and boron mine in Nevada. So it's going to be a Nevada lithium mine, and just I guess some of the stats that were on the site or on the BLM site, but they it established that the mine will supply lithium to power 370,000 EVs annually, and then it'll employ 500 workers during construction and 350 during mining operations, and there was an estimated $125 million in wages annually. I wasn't really quite sure how, I didn't understand. I guess I didn't look into it a ton, but what it meant by when it said we'll supply lithium to power 370,000 EVs annually. I don't know. I guess for the sake of the example I'm doing here, which is crude to say the least, I just went ahead and established that meant that they would have supply enough lithium to produce 370,000 batteries for EVs per year. I don't know if that's what it means at all. I could be way off. And then I just did some like quick research. So again, this very crude, very basic, just an example here. But I did some research or just looked up and what an average lithium battery for an EV needs in terms of lithium, and it was like it said 8 kilograms of lithium per EV battery. And then I just looked up the basic price as per 1023.24, and lithium was going at $10.04 per kilogram. So I guess I'll just start off. I mean, I like in terms of like in favor of the GML, like this is gonna it's definitely this operation's gonna bring a lot of people jobs, total 850 jobs, but 500 workers for construction, another 350 during mining operations. Estimated 125 million in wages annually. So it's obviously gonna have some really good at least local economic benefits to those workers that are going to be working in this mine, especially assuming that they're going to be locals. Also it's going to be supplying it's hitting that critical mineral. Lithium was definitely one of those big critical minerals in the reading. So it's it's stabilizing or kind of ensuring some sort of critical mineral supply there domestically, and then it's supplying. It'll be good for I guess electric vehicles as well. It's like so looking at that side of the coin, this is a pretty good deal. And there was one thing in the EIS apparently where I guess the biggest concern was this species of buckwheat that apparently this area this mine falls within the range of it, endangered species of buckwheat. But they had also determined that the mining operation will have a pretty minimal impact on that, minimal to none. I can't remember the exact language. In the EIS, that's what it said. So, but I did also I don't know, based on my assumption one of that 370,000 EVs annually means 370,000 batteries. That might just be way wrong. But anyways, and then also my basic research as well. I went ahead and just kind of tried to calculate, what would be like a year's worth of royalties if there were royalties charged on this. So I just kind of went with 370,000 batteries, 8 kilograms of battery. So then that kind of comes out to, just to find the yearly amount of lithium or kilograms of lithium produced by the mine. And then I just took that and multiplied it by that $10.04. Obviously that price is very, susceptible to change. It could raise, it could lower, so that's not fixed. And even just looking at the graphs for lithium, I'd noticed, at least on the site I was on, it had actually I don't know how far back it went, but at one point it was $22 per kilogram. So it's come down a bit. I'm not sure what the cause is there, or if that graph I looked at was any good. But anyways, so I just did basic, $10 per kilogram of lithium, multiplied that by the yearly amount of lithium that this mine would produce. And that kind of gave me the yearly profit that this mine might generate. And then I kind of took that times that 12.5% was the proposed, that's one of the commonly proposed royalty fees. And so I just took that times that 12.5% or 12.5% of that 29 million. And that kind of came out to $3 million per year, close to $4 million per year. So that way like I said, I made a lot of assumptions and stretches on this, so this is not realistic, I don't think, at all. But I kind of just wanted to, if they were correcting royalties on this, then that would be money. I don't know if that $4 million could go to reclamation funds, or just back to the the local, more local county, state, government share the profits a bit. But at the same time, you got to look at the other side, and you see the employee, the local employment that this is going to offer, the wages, is going to offer, the stabilizing a critical mineral supply chain, electric vehicles, I guess. So there's, it's, I don't think it's super black and white, between reforming and maintaining. I'm definitely going to fence it on this one a little bit. But I think that it could be, I don't know, I think there's, I'll move on. Let's see, where was I? Okay. Can the U.S. Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management regulate mining on the federal lands it manages? If so, what specific law or regulation could it use to do so? Can the U.S. Forest Service or BLM categorically say no to a proposed hard rock mine to be located on lands not withdrawn from mineral entry? Why is this a tricky question? So for this one, he says just to select either, select one agency. So I just went with the BLM. And then so the BLM in FLIPMA, wrong way. I got one kind of pertains to this. Okay, so within the BLM, in its Organic Act, FLIPMA, there's a clause that that states that the secretary, in managing the public lands, the secretary shall take through regulation or otherwise action to prevent any unnecessary or undue degradation of the lands. So that gives them a bit of a hook, and then they go on to use this to implement their 3809 rules. And essentially what these 3809 rules are, the rules are regulations that miners can do, must follow in order to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation. However, that it is, it's limited in that clause is limited in its reach and in its hook because, land degradation, it might be necessary or due, in mining. So so they're limited because there's going to be land degradation. It might be necessary to mine, or due land degradation might be necessary for mining. Like I said, so they're limited in reach, but it does provide the BLM a hook to regulate, to put in regulations for mining. And there's also within those 309 rules, there's the plan of operations requirement before, so that plan of operations must be submitted by the operator before any mining can begin, and that pertains to non-casual use mining. We didn't get a whole lot into the difference between casual use and non-casual use, but I think it's based on I think it's size of the claim, and then also maybe the amount of estimated disturbance as well. These 3809 regulations, they also include performance standards, specific standards, and some of these are. I know the plan of operations, requires a reclamation plan, and then that, the operator must provide, I think here, I got it right here. The operator must provide us a financial guarantee based on an estimate of what it would cost the BLM to hire a third party to reclaim that, to reclaim the operation. So there is a reclamation bond within that plan of operations. So while the GML doesn't have it, this regulation does. The plan also undergoes a NEPA analysis, that plan of operations. So there is, looking at the effects of the potential effects of mining. And then, like I said, you got your performance standards, which are also part of the 3809 rules, and that kind of just covers technology, land use plans, mitigation, reclamation, and then there's some more specific standards that pertain to waste disposal and what must be included in the reclamation plan. Leaching of contaminants, and then there's also then it even mentions they have to just follow the air and water standards of the local, the state and the federal air and water standards as well in their in their mining operation. The BLM cannot, they still can't say outright no to mining, that's being pursued under the GML. I guess withdrawn lands, obviously not, but. They can't say no. They can't prevent a person from exploring and mining the federal public domain. The BML, however, it's they can. Yes, they can't, but they technically can a little bit. They can kick the can down the road. They can as long as they don't until that plan of operations is approved, the mining can't start. So they could keep preventing that plan of operations to go through and preventing mining from taking place. What is meant by the term agency capture? I'll go back to this side. Oh, sweet. Okay. Agencies, so agencies work in a narrower field. Well, I guess I wish you could see it just a little clearer. But, okay, so here's the agency capture side. First here you got these powerful corporations, interest groups, tactics. And I guess I'll also preface this by saying that, these agencies like the BLM or the Forest Service, they work in a much narrower field than Congress does. They're working pretty much constantly, or a lot of the time, directly or very closely with these powerful corporations or special interest groups. These could be mining, grazing, ranchers, mining companies, timber companies, especially with the Forest Service, timber companies or mining companies with the BLM. But they're working very closely with these interests. And so these interests might use tactics such as lobbying, financial contributions, or even lucrative job offers towards these agency personnel, Forest Service personnel, BLM personnel, and through these lobbying, financial contributions, job offers, the agency personnel and the agency might eventually start to favor the interests of the industry. If they're going to be getting these incentives back, they're going to start to favor the industry interests over the national interest. And when they're by favoring the industry interests, this might result in lax enforcement of regulations or weakened protections and policies. And that that's kind of how an agency gets captured, essentially, is just working closely, and then the agency or the industry that has things that they want, and they use these tactics to achieve, to capture these agency personnel, the agency. It's, I guess, I don't know, I have some here, I think that, okay, yeah, so it's like, eventually, it becomes like, the industry influence over the agency that is supposed to regulate them over time, that the people that are supposed to be supervising and enforcing regulations become, their interests start to align with the industry. And I guess like an example, I don't know, it doesn't really pertain to like this class, but like, and I don't know if this is like set in stone stuff or anything, or known, like proven, but I saw in one of the videos I was watching about it, they mentioned the 2008 recession, how financial and bank regulation kind of failed due to an influence from banks that they were supposed to regulate. So I guess like, had these big banking, companies here, or big banks, here, and then you had like, your company, banking regulatory agencies here, and eventually over time, the interests of the banking regulation, agencies began to align with the industry, and so that resulted in lax enforcement, weakened protections, and etc. Okay, moving on. What is meant by the term agency capture? Please explain the term by making reference to either mining, mineral leasing, or rangeland law and management. How can citizen suits and/or judicial review provisions provide a check and balance on agency or on captured agencies? I think I got one that kind of pertains to this one. Here we go. So I guess to start with, I'll just go with the beginning first part of the question, and going through the rangeland law side. I guess I'll go back to a different slide that's got something a little more pertaining to this. So in FLIPMA of 1976, there's Section 309, which essentially is the advisory council clause, which states that 10 to 15 locals are appointed by the secretary, and they're supposed to give advice and give advice to the secretary in respect of the land, with respect of land use planning, classification, retention, management, and the disposal of public lands within the area. So they're working very closely with, they're working within these land use planning decisions for these BLM public lands. So it's a concentrated interest, a local concentrated interest, working closely with the BLM. And kind of going back to the last one, over time, they're gonna they could maybe implement those tactics, and build up relationships and build up influence over those BLM personnel. That group is gonna be able to, the interests of those locals will eventually, over time and through influence, will become the BLM will favor those interests as well, and that I guess I can go back to the slide. but yeah, then that'll could lead to lax enforcement, and like I said, just more aligning with the local interests of those local advisory councils. And there was this provision, as also there was a similar one, in the Taylor Grazing Act. The grazing advisory boards were made up of locals, and that kind of resulted in this home rule, and that still kind of, I guess, transcends into the FLIPMA as well. And then I guess I'll go on to the next part. So then how could a citizen or group of citizens get standing to sue against a potential captured agency? So there's the Sierra Club versus Hardin case, which is a Forest Service case, but it still it shows how one can get standing in a scenario like this. So it refers to the APA. They get standing in this case via judicial review under the APA. But the APA states that a person suffering legal wrong because of agency action or adversely affected or aggrieved by agency action within the meaning of a relevant statute is entitled to judicial review thereof. So the courts essentially, the courts established that someone seeking a review under the provision must meet two criteria. They must show that the challenged action has caused injury in the fact, economic or otherwise, and that the interest sought to be protected must be arguably within the zone of interest, a zone of interest protected or regulated by a statute or a constitutional guarantee. So for the first part in this case, the courts have determined that it's generally recognized the type of injury that will show that which will support standing to sue in the public interest does not need to be economic, but may be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. So that kind of meets the first step in this when challenging this large, massive, like 8 billion board foot timber sale plus pulp mill complex as well being installed. So that they met the first standing or first requirement to get standing in this case under the judicial review. And then they also determined that the Sierra Club has 300 to 400 members in Alaska at the time of this case at least, and there was organized groups that were in Juneau that had regularly enjoyed the timber sale area. So the courts then determined that under the circumstances of this case, Sierra Club and the Sitka Conservation Society have standing to assert the aesthetic, conservational, and recreational interests of local members and users who are directly affected by the timber sale and proposed pulp mill complex. So essentially what this case established is that someone could have standing to sue, a citizen suit could have standing under the judicial review provision of the APA as long as they meet these criteria, which were shown in this case to be, pretty, if they can show that, has caused injury, that injury can extend to, doesn't have to be economic, but it can be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. And then, as long as they're, and then the zone of interest, if that person is within, I guess, like if they're within an immediate area, they that also, then that's the second, that I think, yeah, so that gives them standing as well. And I can't remember, there was a case they had cited, the California, San Francisco case they had cited. But yeah, so this case established that, a citizen could have standing to sue a potentially, an agency that might be captured. I don't know. I guess the agency captured didn't have a whole lot to tie in. It was, it was considered, it was a super favorable sale, and it had broken a lot of regulations. It was just a matter of how did they have standing or not. What does it mean when someone says that a hard rock mining claim or federal lands grazing permit or timber sale is a subsidy? So I've covered this a little bit already, especially with the GML. But these are referred to as subsidies because the cost to mine or graze on federal public lands is comparably cheaper than it would be on private land. And I guess with this one, I just went with the grazing fees particularly. But BLM grazing fees or BLM and Forest Service grazing fees are the same. They charge the same. But yes, so the minimum for BLM and Forest Service grazing fee is $1.35 per AUM, and the highest that it's ever been, which was way back in 1981, was $2.31 per AUM. And then your state lands grazing fees typically range between $1.35 per AUM and $80 per AUM, and your private lands grazing fees typically average between $8 per AUM and $23 per AUM. So by offering these cheaper options to graze cattle or mine, and I guess in this case to graze cattle, the federal government is incentivizing and subsidizing grazing on those federal public lands. It's a lot cheaper for a rancher to graze cattle on that federal land than it would be on on average at least than private or state lands. And then the state lands, I guess we mentioned this in class, but the state lands, their goal is to generate revenue for their beneficiaries, especially on those trust lands. So they're going to be definitely charging, their goal is to make money. And same with, private lands. It's typically if someone's leasing out a pasture for grazing, they're probably hoping to make some money off of it. And it should be noted too that it's not just the, wanting to make money or subsidize, ranchers. It could also be that those federal public lands are, maybe lower quality grazing as well. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about the issue? So grazing fees were established under the. Let me actually go back to that slide. So grazing fees were established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, and essentially, I think the language around them was it was supposed to be a reasonable fee in order to administer the range, and this was kind of this was coming, Great Depression had hit. And they were in the midst of the Dust Bowl, so there was lots of land degradation was a big problem, or big concern, big issue of the time. So the grazing fee was implemented to administer the range, and maybe improve management. But yeah, it was just a reasonable fee. It was I don't have the numbers, but it was pretty cheap, cheaper than what it is now. It's just a price to be paid by a leaseholder. Charged per AUM animal unit month, which is the amount of forage that is needed for an animal unit to be supported for a month. So it's not a unit of area, but a unit of biomass. Outside, I don't need to go into it. And then in 1976 in FLIPMA, the BLM, they state, in FLIPMA there's a clause stating that the BLM wants to achieve fair market value for the use of its public lands. So they put a moratorium on changing the price of the fee until they can calculate a new fee that is equitable to both the agency and the leaseholders. So they kind of put a freeze on changing the price until they can establish what the new fee is going to be. And then 2 years later you got PREA, which comes out, the PREA Act. I can't remember the actual name for it now. But anyway, PREA comes out in 1978, and this act essentially establishes a grazing fee equation, which is based on three things: private, grazing leases prices, the cost of cattle production, and then the cattle prices at market. So it'll change with those, as those three variables change. The controversy surrounding grazing fees, as I mentioned in the previous question, is that they're largely considered a subsidy. They're typically far cheaper of an option to graze cattle than state or private grazing fees. Federal lands, and then I guess another big part of that is that the BLM and Forest Service typically spend way more money maintaining rangelands than they generate in revenue from grazing fees. And I just had a little fact here from 2017 that stated that the BLM had appropriated $79 million for range management and collected $18.3 million in grazing fees. Now, I don't know. I think that's kind of a weird fact. I went into this in the last video. But I guess obviously that would be, I don't think, obviously they're not maintaining rangelands solely for grazing. So I don't know, if they're not maintaining them solely for grazing, would the expectation be then that grazing was going to cover the costs of them? I don't know. But maybe they should. I mean, that's a pretty big gap, and that granted that's an old statement too. But the price of grazing fees, I don't think has changed much since 2017 either. I think it maybe has. I know it's been $1.35 for a while. It's been the minimum. I don't know if it's gone up at all since that. But yeah, essentially, yeah, they're considered subsidies, and they don't bring in a whole lot of money to the agency. So those are definitely just two kind of broad ways that they're considered controversial. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about the issue? What guidance do federal range laws provide regarding grazing fees on BLM lands? Be sure to include relevant provisions from FLPMA and the Public Rangelands Improvement Act. Okay. So, like I said in the last one, grazing fees were established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. They were to be a reasonable fee charged to cover the cost of administering the range. They were charged to leaseholders on a per animal unit month basis. And then so we got FLPMA in 1976 comes out with the statement, the clause stating that the U.S. should receive fair market value for the use of public lands. However, they place a moratorium on the fee increases until the Forest Service and the BLM could determine what fee would be equitable for the Treasury and those who held permits. And then Public Rangelands Improvement Act comes out in 1978, 2 years later. And so essentially Congress then, in that act, they legislated a formula to calculate grazing fees with a base value of $1.23 per AUM. And then they adjust for the cost of private grazing lease rates, as well as cattle prices and the cost of production. And $1.35 is the per AUM is the minimum that can be charged. The highest that it's ever been is $1.30 or $2. Oh, shoot, I forgot that number. $2.31 per AUM was the highest it ever had been, and that was back in 1981. Okay. The Taylor Grazing Act includes a provision stating the Secretary of Interior shall manage public lands pending their final disposal. How did FLPMA change this provision? So, in FLPMA, 1976 comes out, and there is a provision that simply states the public lands be retained in federal ownership. So this essentially, that statement stated that FLPMA essentially stated that the final disposal that was mentioned in Taylor was going to be in the federal government's hands. That land was not going to be disposed of to private or state. And so that kind of leads into the next question. What is a common theme found in past to present versions of the Sagebrush Rebellion? How does a central tenet of this movement challenge the pervasive theme found in federal law that public lands be managed and conserved in the national interest? So, Sagebrush, so I guess going back to here, 1976, FLPMA, the public lands be retained in federal ownership, and this establishes that final disposal into the federal government's hands the final disposal was into the federal government hands. Well, so, prior to passage of FLPMA, many, ranchers and people had these, had been holding these leases with the idea that eventually that the final disposal of these lands, these grazing lands established under the Taylor Grazing Act, would be into private, the lands would be sold. So eventually they figured they'd be able to, purchase the lease or they'd become owner of the lease. But FLPMA comes out and, shuts the door on that completely. And then also, around the time of FLPMA, in 1976, you also have the Kleppe versus New Mexico case. Big, case showing, how the power of the government can reach, and over preempt state rights. And then you also have, a series of environmental protection acts in the early 70s as well that all kind of build up into the, into the first iteration of a Sagebrush Rebellion in the late 70s. And, a common theme of that is just like the loss of control, of local control over public federal lands. And, the wanting of transferring of that land either to the locals or the state, or even just, maybe having more local authority over that, over that public, the loss of local authority over public federal lands. And then, FLIPMA, also has, Section 102, that has the clause that states that the lands be retained in federal ownership. But then it also goes on to say that the national interest will be best realized if the public lands and their resources are periodically. So it basically states that the national interest will also must be considered in the land use planning process. So it directly focuses in or directly references the national interest instead of just the local interests of that had been kind of considered under the Taylor Grazing Act. So a shifting of that preferred use by locals for those public federal lands to more of the broad national interest to be considered in those land use plans. So less concern for So it's just but really based on the idea of the loss of like local control and the increase of favoring national interest, which might be more multiple use. It might include more multiple uses than the local interest, which could be focused more on local stuff, local economy stuff such as grazing or mining. Describe the multiple use mandate as found in FLIPMA. How much management discretion does it provide to the Bureau of Land Management? What do resource management plans as required by FLIPMA and NEPA have to do with multiple use? Provide an example in your answer. Okay, I think I got a few slides for this one. So, Section 202 of FLIPMA states that the Secretary needs to use and observe the principles of multiple use and sustained yield when developing these land resource, these RMPs, resource management plans. And then Section 103 defines multiple use here. I got it on the board, but essentially, it calls for like balancing, the multiple uses of the land, the public federal lands. Like here's a line, will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. The use of some land for less than all of the resources, and then it lists off a bunch of different uses that need resource uses that need to be taken into account, and this is like goes on for renewable, non-renewables, recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife, fish, natural and scenic, scientific, and historical values. So it's very broad. It's there's not a lot of like direct forcing of what should be considered in multiple use. I guess it's broad. Lots of I don't know, for some reason to me it reminds me of Section 101 of NEPA a little bit. It's very just like, I don't know, it doesn't really seem like there's any real action forcing in here. It's mostly just like, it seems kind of aspirational, and in class we talked about it a lot, but like just depending at what angle you want to come at this from, say if you're interested in resource production, you can read this and find things that'll curry to your favor. You could just be like, but it says we should maybe be making the most judicious use of the land, and for use of land for the renewable and non-renewables, or it's got range, timber, and minerals. But you could also come at it from a conservation aspect too, and it's you see watershed, wildlife, fish, natural, scenic, and historical values without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment. So it's, I don't know, like we mentioned, talked about a lot in classes. It's just like, I don't know, and it just feels really aspirational. I don't know, I'll just kind of move on to here, I guess. So and then you got cases like NRDC versus Hodel in 1985, which essentially like the courts even come in and say like, there's it's hardly they are general clauses and phrases which can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion, and it breeds discretion at every pore, which is pretty vivid language, but it essentially sums up that this is super discretionary, and it doesn't hold the agency, like it doesn't limit agency discretion really much when it pertains to considering multiple uses, or what multiple uses be considered in land use planning. So then, kind of moving on, like how does NEPA, like RMPs required by FLPMA and NEPA have to do with multiple use. And so you go to the comb wash allotment case. I got that here on this one. And, the BLM had relied on a programmatic EIS, conducted for the RMP of the San Juan Resource Area for authorization. But essentially, okay, so they have this programmatic EIS and RMP in place, and they authorize grazing in the comb wash allotment. It gets taken to court. They get litigated over doing this, over allowing grazing in this comb wash allotment, and essentially without, the courts remand, the BLM in this case, and because the BLM simply just didn't, they violated Section 10 or 302 of FLPMA because they authorized grazing in this allotment by not engaging in reasoned and informed decision making. So, they didn't have an allotment management plan, and they didn't do a site-specific EIS. And so, they didn't show that they had balanced the competing resource values in the canyon. So, it seems like, and the judge even says, like, the BLM violated FLPMA by failing to make reasoned and informed decision-making, that the benefits of grazing the canyons outweigh the costs. So, it kind of just, if the BLM had prepared a site-specific EIS and had shown that they had reasonably and informedly concluded that grazing in the comb wash was in the best interest by weighing it against other interests, they would not have been in violation of FLPMA or NEPA. So pretty much, I guess what I'm getting at with that case is that, I guess, like, the only way that agency discretion could be challenged, agency discretion in pertaining to multiple use, is if they don't do it in a reasoned and informed manner. And in this case, they didn't conduct NEPA or an EIS on that site-specific level, and they didn't show that they had balanced, the competing resources. What is the multiple use mandate given to the BLM, and why is the multiple use mandate given to the BLM and Forest Service considered so discretionary? So I feel like I've kind of been rambling on about this a lot already, but Secretary shall manage the public lands under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield. It's just multiple use has got such a broad and long and broad definition that can be, depending on what angle you want to come at it from, you can definitely make it work to your advantage. It doesn't. It offers the agency a lot of discretion. It doesn't force the agency to make any certain decisions pertaining to multiple use. And it's very broad. I don't know how else to describe it. I don't know if I'm answering these right. I don't know. Multiple uses got me confused a little bit. Multiple use, according to the FLPMA, is defined as, I'm not going to read the definition of multiple use. The BLM's new FLPMA regulations state that conservation is a use on par with other uses of the public lands under FLPMA's multiple use and sustained yield framework. Do you believe that the BLM's interpretation of multiple use in this proposed regulation is lawful, or does it exceed the agency's statutory authority under FLPMA? In other words, does it go too far? Please explain, making a reference to agency discretion and the court's interpretation of multiple use. So, yes, the BLM has come out with this new conservation addition to multiple use, which essentially establishes conservation as a multiple use on par with other multiple uses of agency of public lands. And in the regulation, they state it's directly as a response to climate change. And then, in the definition in FLPMA of conservation, it states that, management of natural resources to promote protection and restoration, facilitate the use of conservation to support ecosystem resilience. And then it even, has this line that states that, including a new tool in restoration and mitigation leases. So that's kind of interesting. It offers this idea of a potential for like leases solely for restoration and mitigation purposes. Conservation is a use, and that protection and restoration are tools to achieve conservation. And then also this new conservation rule does address ASECs, which are in originally in FLTMA, but it recognizes them to as contributing to ecosystem resilience. So I think it kind of extends the reach. This conservation rule extends the reach of those potential ASECs, or when they can be implemented. They can be used, and it says that ASEC designation can be used to protect landscape intactness and habitat connectivity. So I think it expands when those areas of critical environmental concern can be used as well with this new rule, on par with conservation and promoting ecosystem resilience in face of climate change. So is this a lawful interpretation of multiple use by the BLM? So for this part, I went to Perkins versus Berglund, and essentially this case, the courts found that the multiple use language, such as which will best meet the needs of the American people and making the most judicious use of the land, to be hardly limits on agency discretion. There's the famous line again: breathe discretion at every pore. And so then the courts also stated that the courts aren't at liberty to break the tie by choosing one theory of rain management as superior to another. And then so by stating that, it's the courts, the courts could not say on whether the changes to the grazing. This is I'm still on the Perkins Berglund case in here, but so the courts could not say on whether the changes to the grazing capacity in that case, because it was, I guess I don't even have the details of the Perkins v. Berglund case on the slide there, but it was a challenge of Forest Service who had changed the reduced stocking rates on a grazing lease, and they were challenged in this decision to reduce stocking rates that had cited over grazing. But the courts stated, like I just mentioned, they're not at liberty to break the tie between one grazing system over another, or one range management system over another. So the courts couldn't say the courts could not say on whether the changes to the grazing capacity were in line with multiple use. They could only they could only review the decision under the arbitrary and capricious standard, and specifically looking at the agency's reasoning behind reducing those stocking rates. So I think by adopting conservation as a multiple use, the Secretary is managing the public lands and their various resource values so that they're utilized in a combination. So I think I don't think I think it is a lawful use of multiple use, because the courts, that's agency discretion. Like we've mentioned, it's established already, multiple use is super discretionary, and if it were to be taken to court, it's not up to the courts on whether conservation is a better multiple use over grazing, or some other multiple use, range or timber. But the only way it could be challenged is if as long as the agency has reasonably and informedly made the decision to use grazing in that scenario. They can only look at the reasoning behind it, the rational connection between what they found on that public land and the decision to use conservation as the multiple use there. Describe two provisions found in FLTMA that can be used to advocate for and or achieve conservation-oriented outcomes on public lands. So FLTMA section 202, like I've mentioned in this one here, is the give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concerns, or ASECs, as previously mentioned. These are areas where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historical, cultural, scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, or other natural systems or processes, or to protect life. But they're designated areas with and these areas have special management attentions, and so this these will be identified while the resource management plan is being drafted, and then in the plan, these areas, these ASECs, will have certain protections and in place to ensure those values, as mentioned in the definition, are protected, or at least considered. And these regulations might limit allowed uses within that area. And I guess like another recent case. You probably can't see it, but I was reading about this Gunnison sage grouse in Colorado, and how I guess there was some Senate hearing about Lauren Boebert, or congressional hearing. Lauren Boebert took it made some statement about the Gunnison sage grouse and how I don't know that doesn't really apply. But anyway, there was these. The main thing is that there are these ASECs in Colorado that had been identified, and it was about 2 million acres, BLM acres, and these ASECs were designated to protect these Gunnison sage grouse populations, and they eliminated oil and gas leasing activities on those lands, or limit the oil and gas leasing activity on those lands. So it was just kind of an example of how those ASECs could be implemented, or what they can do when implemented. FLIPMA's unnecessary or undue degradation provision. How has this statutory provision and its regulation been used in the past in the context of hard rock mining on federal lands? So, like I mentioned previously with it, where do we go? Okay. So, with that unnecessary undue degradation, you have the 3809 rules, which are essentially regulations that are there in order so mining operations don't do I don't think do is the right word, but don't commit unnecessary or undue degradation to public lands. But like historically, and I think in particular there was in the Clinton administration they had changed the definition to unnecessary or undue degradation to conditions, activities, practices that result in substantial or irreparable harm that cannot be mitigated. So by changing that definition and and extending it to that result in substantial or irreparable harm that cannot be mitigated, I guess that kind of it extends the reach of that unnecessary or undue degradation clause, and it allowed the BLM to prohibit mining operations, that would otherwise maybe be in compliance with relevant environmental laws. If the BLM had determined that those operations were had broken that new definition established by the Clinton administration. However, this regulation was shortly after repealed by the Bush administration when they came in. So, I mean, that was just one time in history that that regulation had been had been changed. And that's also been kind of another big thing with the unnecessary or undue degradation, or any of these these statute definitions, is that over time they will, depending on who's in office and who's the executive and the goals of that executive, the definitions are going to change and the regulations could change as well. A common statement made by the courts when reviewing either the FLIPMA or the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act is that the multiple use mandate breathes discretion at every pore. What do they mean by this statement? Essentially by this statement, the courts mean that multiple use mandates only offer broad and general phrases expressing concern and desire for the environment. They offer a lot of discretion to the agencies in planning for, multiple uses of lands. They don't, the courts have no say over how an agency manages for multiple use. They're judges, not range masters. That was a big one from the NRDC versus Hodel. And the courts only have say if the agency came to that management decision in an arbitrary or capricious way, with maybe a lack of properly informed reason making, like we saw in, what case was that? I think it was the comb wash allotment case where they didn't have that clear reasoned and informed decision making. Then the courts were able to step in and and limit the agency discretion, but that's about it. That's why. Yeah. What are the primary purposes of NIFMA, of National Forest under the U.S. Forest Service 1897 Organic Act? So it was kind of heavily based off Gifford Pinchot's wise use philosophy that forest lands should not be locked up; they should be definitely be utilized. And then there was coming off the heels of the 1891 Forest Reserves Act, and kind of leading right up to the passage of the Forest Service Organic Act. President Grover Cleveland was just going, I don't know, it sounded like in the book he was kind of just going nuts with the creating these forest reserves, just going, yeah, making tons of forest reserves all over the place. And so this would, this act kind of was passed to rope that in a little bit. And but really the three main things that this Forest Organic Act establishes, that the forest, it's established in order that the Forest Service improve and protect forests, provide a continuous supply of lumber, which is a big one, will be a big one for like the first half of the Forest Service life, and then securing favorable conditions of water flows. Those are like those are the three main purposes of the Organic Act. Briefly stated, how did the conflict over the Bitterroot and or Monongahela National Forest lead to reform of National Forest Law and the passage of NIFMA? Describe one detailed provision of NIFMA for illustration. So, I guess with I don't know if I got anything for this in the slides. I guess, this is about all I got. I don't got a whole lot of Forest Service stuff, but anyway, so with the Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, there were 3 timber sales, and in which of those sales, 428 acres were going to be clear cut. And by doing so, the Forest Service had in these sales had directly violated the Organic Act language that that stated that trees could only be cut and sold if they are dead, matured, or large growth, and may be only sold when sale serves the purpose of preserving and or promoting the younger growth of timber on the national forest. And then the judge went on to like specifically define some of these major dead, matured, or large growth. And where it kind of came to a head was like the judge had defined large as a single tree that was had grown large, large DVH. But the Forest Service up until this point had been defining large growth as on the stand level of a large growth of stand. That stand has a large growth. I don't know, but big stand, lots of trees growing, not on the individual trees. So that they had kind of used that as their in executing these sales. And then they also additionally hadn't been didn't mark the timber in these sales prior to the sale, which is apparently also in the Organic Act requirement that timber be marked. But essentially, as this case results in an essential ban on clear cutting, and I think all timber harvest came to a stop after this case while they were trying to figure out how to go about it, especially with the redefinitions of large, mature, and dead, especially large growth. So then, this kind of triggers Congress that wanting to limit the over reliance on clear cutting that had been previously established. So NIFMA was then passed in 1976 to regulate and establish standards for land resource management planning. And then in Section 6 of NIFMA particularly, I think Section 6E particularly has provides specific statutory rules about specifications of timber harvests and when clear cutting can be used. So it directly addresses clear cutting and states that clear cutting only can be used when it is the optimal method of harvest. So NIFMA comes out and directly is statutorily makes rules directed towards clear cutting. Yeah. What are the most significant ways that NIFMA constrained the amount of discretion that the Forest Service had under the 1897 Organic Act and the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960? Please be sure to discuss the issue of wildlife somewhere in your answer. So in 1976, NIFMA comes out and it requires each national forest or grassland to write a land resource management plan. And the idea of this plan was it became a 3-tiered approach. So top tier, you have your national NIFMA statutory regulations, and then tier 2, you got your forest level plans, which regulate activities within the forest area and provide long-term goals and desired conditions of the forest. And then on your third tier, you got your site-specific projects, under NIFMA, it must be consistent with the forest goals, the goals in the forest plan. And you got maybe your management areas and stuff too in that third tier. So NIFMA also includes this wildlife diversity mandate, which had been previously, wildlife. There hadn't been any specific, enforceable, substantive rules, for managing wildlife, in forest, in the Organic Act. And then the multiple use had a brief mention of it. But, essentially NIFMA requires that forest plans to provide for diversity of plant and animal communities. And that's based, that's pretty big, so that, they establishes the Forest Service has to provide for those diversity of plant and animal communities. Then, so this is like I said, substantive and enforceable requirement for the Forest Service, not found in the Organic Act or MUSIA. Then another part of NIFMA, Section 6H of NIFMA, essentially states that the Secretary of Interior has to appoint a committee of scientists, non-U.S. Forest Service employees, to provide technical and scientific information on proposed guidelines and procedures. So this led to regulations that require maintenance of habitat to ensure. So it furthered on the wildlife diversity mandate, but the Secretary has to appoint this non-Forest Service group of scientists to assist in this situation, which further kind of limits the discretion of the agency as well. I don't know if there's much else I want to hit on that. Obviously, it vastly limited the what kind of timber harvests can be used when and where, and under what conditions can they be used. Shoot, I am running out of time. How does the concept of multiple use differ from NIFMA's wildlife mandate? What NIFMA's wildlife diversity mandate in terms of agency discretion, flexibility, and enforcement? Be sure to reference wildlife diversity / viability and the role of the courts in your answer. So, the wildlife diversity mandate, like I mentioned the last one, it has obligations for the Forest Service for conserving fish and wildlife in NIFMA, in those forest planning requirements. It's an enforceable and substantive statute for the U.S. Forest Service, and constrains the management activities. And it requires that forest plans provide for diversity of plants and animals communities. What else do I got here? So I guess the courts still have to, even with the wildlife diversity mandate in play, the courts still have to defer to agency discretion when managing for wildlife diversity, as long as the methods ensure population viability. So I guess in this case I have here, Sierra Club versus Merida, there was a challenge of a resource management plan on 2 national forests in Wisconsin, on the basis they failed to use conservation biology in planning to maintain biological diversity. And I think conservation biology is essentially the study that small pockets of of habitat don't support diversity near as well as a continuous chunk of habitat. But the courts ruled that the Forest Service still did comply with the NIFMA statutes and regulatory mandates and NEPA, because they can't. The agency still has discretion on what method they use to manage wildlife diversity. As long as they do it, they still have the discretion on how they do it. There's not a particular way. The courts can't say it's similar, I guess, to courts, not range masters. It's still to the discretion of the agency on how they manage for whether it's multiple use or in this case wildlife diversity. As long as they do it, I think, in a reasoned and informed way, then it flies. I guess I mentioned MUSIA here in 1960. It did have some it had some statement that the U.S. Forest Service has some responsibility to consider fish and wildlife in national forests, but there was no requirements to conserve them in any specific way. are just to consider them in the multiple use decision making, and lots of discretion in multiple use decision making, as was iterated in Perkins versus Berglund. What is what is NIFMA's plan consistency provision? So I kind of touched on the last one, but essentially what the plan consistency provision states is that, like, these at the smallest level, you got your site specific projects. These must be consistent with the forest level plans, and then the forest level plans have to be consistent with the NIFMA regulations, and the NIFMA regulations have to be consistent with the NIFMA level statutes. So it's just essentially ensuring, it ensures and it states that each lower tier has to be consistent with the tier above it. So yeah, like I said, site specific projects have to be consistent with the forest plan. The forest plan has to be consistent with the NIFMA regulations, and the NIFMA regulations have to be consistent with the NIFMA statutory laws, the rules. What are management area designations / zones as found in land and resource management plans? So yeah, your management areas and zones are essentially these areas within a national forest, and they're required for the approval of they need to be designated in order for an LRMP to be approved. But they're area prescriptions, like specific areas within a national forest with prescriptions applying to future activities in that management area. Resource integration, minimum specific management requirements, and they're essentially like zoning ordinances under which future decisions are made. So they might restrict what can happen in a certain area, or they might call for certain things to be done in that area within a national forest. Describe 2 ways total that NIFMA imposed legal constraints on timber harvesting and provided protection on wildlife in national forests. So first one, going back, there was the wildlife diversity mandate, section 6.3b, which essentially states that they, in forest planning, they have to provide for the diversity of plant and animal communities. So yeah, I mean that's a pretty good forcing, So they have to consider, the diversity of plants and animals while developing a forest plan. That's your first constraint, and then within under in the NIFMA regulations made by the group of scientists, you have your further regulation come out that those populations need to be maintained as viable as well. And then then you got your section 6, your timber harvest requirements that limit adequate, timber harvest where it can be adequately restocked within 5 years, protection for water resources, selection of harvest systems, not solely because, it would offer the greatest economic return. Obviously, like we talked about earlier, those regulations on clear cutting, and that they can only be implemented when it's the optimum method of harvest. And then you also, like I said earlier, when drafting those NIFMA regulations, having that non-forest service team come in to advise on those regulations. All right, that's all she wrote. All I wrote. Yeah. So, yeah, got through it. There was just, like I said, there's still a few on there I'm not 100% on, or not a lot I'm 100% on, but there's a few that I'm definitely questioning my standing on, but. Yeah, I'm just going to wrap it up. Check the link in the description if anyone actually does end up watching this ever. The link in the description for the textbook information and the class information for when I get, a lot of these answers and stuff. But, thank you. Bye.